to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on Rogers TV. And Mike, we've got a fantastic guest today.
We do, yes.
Someone who is no stranger to Barrie, to Simcoe County. He served as a city councillor. He served as a member of provincial parliament.
Yes.
And he now serves the public's interest. And our guest today is Rod Jackson. Rod is a paralegal and a partner with Full Force Legal Services. Rod, so glad you're able to join us on the show today.
Hello, Rod.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great.
Appreciate it.
So times are interesting, obviously, Rod. We're actually, in a pandemic or at the tail end of a pandemic. Some people might say we're no longer in a pandemic, but just count to 10 and watch the news. But on top of that, we are seeing housing correction. We've gone from record high housing prices, record high rents. We're seeing some correction. We're seeing rising interest rates, etc. It is an interesting time to be in the market, either as a tenant or as a homeowner, depending on where you are and what side of the transaction. So I think there's lots to go into today. Would you not agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The housing market is wild, especially in Barrie, and we see a lot of things happening with it that no one expected. There's so many things that buyers and sellers and renters and landlords need to be aware of to protect themselves.
And even in the best and the calmest of markets where there's time for due diligence, there's always that due diligence needs to be done, dot the I's, cross the T's. And every few transactions out of 100 do end up being challenged and end up in some sort of a legal battle. And certainly we've seen the opportunity for that to be increased through the pandemic, not because of the pandemic per se, but just because of when we got into the bidding wars and the heightened level of buyer activity. Lots of people were putting offers in and omitting the conditions and clauses that would protect all parties in the interest of just having a nice clean offer that's going to get accepted or stand out amongst the others. And there's been a downside to that, and we've possibly seen an increase of legal challenges as a result of that. And I don't know, as a paralegal, have you seen or are you aware of an increase of legal challenges around real estate?
Yeah, it's well. First, I need to state that generally speaking, real estate law is not within a paralegal's scope of practice.
Yeah.
However, there is a lot of things that actually end up on our plate.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we have a few clients who have bought a home and have been victims of fraudulent misrepresentation.
Yeah.
So, for example, you go do a house tour, you look at a house, brand new house that you're looking to buy, and there's beautiful appliances, a nice new fridge and a washer and dryer, and the place is clean and tidy. You're excited. You go to move in, and imagine all the appliances have been removed and replaced with ones that don't work.
Yeah.
Imagine that there's holes in the wall all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So we're ending up with things like that have, essentially, been represented as, all appliances included. And then, they get all the appliances, but none of them work. And they weren't the ones that you looked at when you went in.
Yeah.
That's not, that's fraudulent misrepresentation. So things like that is what people need to watch out for. And there's a lot of ways to avoid that from happening.
Yeah, for sure. And some of the things, if I might say, that I advise my clients is always, well, first of all, do a home inspection and have a home inspector in there who's going to find out if those appliances are working, if the furnace works, if the HVAC, all of the systems are in order. And do that final walkthrough a couple days before closing, where you can reassure yourself that if there were any issues that were flagged during and promised to be fixed before closing, you can then see if they've been done, and your lawyers can hold back funds if the work hasn't been done that's been promised. And the other thing that I advise too, and it's a bit of a gray area because there's privacy concerns, but I say you've always got a camera with you. When you're going through on one of those walkthroughs, take a picture of those appliances, take a picture of the serial number on the appliances. So now you've got documented proof of what was in the offer, what was supposed to be coming with the house. And on closing, if the beautiful Jenn-Air stove is now suddenly an old Maytag, or Whirlpool, whatever, it's...
well, Maytags never broke.
They're never broke, and that's possibly why. But there are, little tips and tricks to avoid ending up in legal things, or at least to protect yourself if you do end up in a legal... Yeah.
I go a step further and even say that, you know, when you're going through the house, if you decide that you like it, the first time around, to have, you know, even take a video of yourself walking around in the house. Make sure you take pictures of the appliances. Luckily, one of the clients I have actually did that on his first walkthrough. He took video of the house. And there's also a video of it online for the ads for the house that the real estate agent had put up. So when we go to court, hopefully we don't have to go to court, but if we do, we have pictures of what was represented when the house was being sold. And time stamped, and you know, we had pictures of the walls without holes in them. We have the pictures of the house in good condition. And what happened? You'd be shocked at what happens between a house between the time people are showing it and the time that they leave it. So I think, Mike, your point of making sure you do a last walkthrough and making that a condition of the sale, making sure you get that last walkthrough before you take possession is critically important.
So Rod, one of the things I wanted to do, though, I think, I want to make sure that our audience is aware and familiar of their options and opportunities to speak with somebody when they're finding themselves in a scenario. Now, one of the things that actually came to light over the last couple of years is that people got very emotionally connected to their transaction. They got emotionally connected to the concept that they might be able to buy a home, or they got emotionally connected to the idea that if they don't act now, they might not be able to buy a home. And so for many, a lot of the logic, rationale, best practice, and reason kind of went out the window in favor of a little bit of emotion and excitement. And it's not surprising. I mean, we called it here a long time ago on Hitting Home, basically saying, careful, there will never be the last good time, and there will always be an opportunity. Make sure that good practices and best judgment always prevails. But as Mike earlier alluded to, a lot of people waived their conditions, whether it was condition of inspection or condition of financing. But Mike, before the show we were talking, and you rightly pointed out that just because someone might have waived certain conditions doesn't mean that the seller, and we're not looking to make all sellers bad, but in this scenario that we were just talking about, doesn't mean that that seller still didn't have legal obligations to act in good faith. But for the sake of our viewer today, as you mentioned, Rod, typically speaking, paralegals are not involved in real estate transactions, but what we're talking about is not a real estate transaction. What we're talking about is something different. And why don't I hand it back over to you, Rod, to explain what is the difference and why are you able to serve the public, and maybe why are you, as a paralegal, not necessarily you at Full Force Legal, there's a plug, but why is a paralegal maybe a good option for somebody to reach out to and get good guidance?
Sure. Well, as you and I mentioned, paralegals don't manage. It's not within our scope to manage real estate transactions. You're
not handling the closing.
So you cannot hire a paralegal to buy a house or to sell a house. But if you run into some legal trouble, well, for example, if the appliances were swapped out on you, or the house isn't in the condition that you want it to be in, and it becomes a small claims court matter, a paralegal is a great option for you. And sometimes you want to make a complaint to the real estate association or to a professional body. Maybe you have a complaint about your broker. Maybe you have a complaint about your mortgage broker, or maybe you have a complaint about your real estate agent, or maybe you have a complaint about the other real estate agent, or maybe the other lawyer, for that matter. Those are things that you can go to a paralegal for. And typically, paralegals specialize in tribunals and small claims court, and typically have quite a bit of experience in those forums compared to a lawyer in many cases. Some lawyers do a lot of that too, and have great experience, but also typically their rates are a fair bit higher. So there's some good value, and there's some good options there for people to go to a paralegal. There's a lot of scope there for people to be helped with from a paralegal. And a lot of people don't realize that Ontario is the only jurisdiction in the world, I think, right now that licenses paralegals. The rest of the world, so to speak, like the U.S. and Canada, all the different provinces in Canada, except for Ontario, do not have licensed paralegals. So
they have them, but they're not licensed. So they're not getting
they
the
have
same
them, but they're
level
not
of,
licensed, and they serve kind of a different purpose. So in Ontario, paralegals are allowed to represent people at small claims court and all the different tribunals. And you know, if you're looking at WSIB or landlord tenant tribunal, or you know, any of the number of hundreds of tribunals, literally hundreds of tribunals out there, paralegal might be your best option.
Now, speaking of tribunals, Rod, I mean, I wanted to get a little bit more into some landlord-tenant stuff down the road, but actually you do have some experience having served on a landlord-tenant board tribunal, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was an adjudicator for the Landlord-Tenant Board for a year. So I was making decisions about disputes to do with landlords and tenants for a year. And that just ended this March, so fairly recently too. And it's pretty crazy what's going on in the Landlord-Tenant Board world right now.
So I think that's actually, Mike, not a bad segue for us to get into, to go to break and to come back on the other side of the break. And let's talk about some of those things that I imagine make up a fair amount of your schedule, your time, and that is ensuring that we understand, I think, Mike, you decided you wanted to coin this show, Rights, Responsibilities, and Recourse, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But so let's get into some of that. What are the rights and responsibilities of both a landlord and a tenant? What are some of the responsibilities? And also, what is the recourse when things don't go, if you will, as planned or in good faith? So we'll be right back with more with Rod Jackson from Full Force Legal Services on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're here with Rod Jackson from, well, at least virtually here with Rod Jackson from Full Force Legal Services. We've been talking in the first segment about real estate rights and responsibilities, and we're going to get into talking a little bit about recourse as well, as they pertain to home buyers, homeowners, home sellers. We can't leave out, though, that we have a very busy and quite frustrating rental market, I would say, just to put it mildly. And the system that is in place provincially that manages and oversees any issues with regards to tenant-landlord disputes, the Landlord and Tenant Commission of Ontario, it's had some of its challenges as well. And just curious off the top, before we even get into it, Rod, would you agree that that system certainly needs to be brought up to date or needs some sort of revamp?
Yeah, it's you know, I kind of saw it in the background, and you know, sort of how the sausage is made, so to speak. And I can tell you they're overburdened with complaints and applications. The waiting list was, you know, tens of thousands of people long, with, you know, I think 30 or 40 adjudicators. Each adjudicator maybe can do 1 or 2 adjudications a week, because you're doing it during an adjudication session. They're doing up to 10 or 15 matters in one session, and then have to write orders for all of those. So it's you know, the adjudicators are overburdened. They have a lot of work to do. So you know, to even take something to the landlord-tenant board, even just to get your application heard, can take, you know, months and months and months, and then to get a decision could take another months and months and months. So you're looking at, you know, minimum a year. They're just coming out of COVID, where it really got backed up, almost 2 years. So you're looking at almost a year before you have your case heard and resolved, which is inappropriate.
Yeah, for issues that more often than not need instant, you know, to be resolved instantly, or if not sooner.
Well, I mean, if you put things into perspective, you've got a tenant who needs to know where if they are going to be housed, or how they are going to be housed. You've got a tenant who, you know, you maybe got a landlord who isn't seeing any income come in and has to make a mortgage payment or has expenses to carry. And I'm not asking anybody to play favorites or to feel sorry for anybody, but just to look at the facts for what they are. Rod, if you're saying it could take a year for an item to resolve, imagine what's happening to all of the people who are sort of caught up in that, you know, that entire engagement. A year can be a very long time, and it can be the difference between survival or not in terms of financial, at least financial security.
Yeah, and to paint the picture for you, I know, and I can tell you from personal experience, I've got clients who, are owed $40,000 in rent.
Yeah.
And the only reason they haven't evicted them is because they haven't been able to get an eviction date from the landlord-tenant board. So, in one case, the person had to sell the house because they couldn't afford to keep it because the people in it weren't paying the rent, and that was how they were paying the mortgage, right? So they got so deep into debt themselves just to cover the mortgage because of the non-payment of rent. It's a little crazy that people are having to do that and wait that long. And a lot of people now, because of that wait, are taking matters into their own hands and taking illegal action to evict people, or you have tenants who are taking illegal action against their landlords because you have the same thing on the tenant side where you have tenants in dilapidated conditions and a landlord not doing anything about it because what are they going to do? Complain to the landlord-tenant board, and it's going to take a year for them to get there, and then and then you got to get an order, and then you have to have the order enforced, which could take another period of time. Because I know that to have an order enforced for a landlord or for a tenant, you have to go to the sheriff through the small claims court, and that can take a period of time. I understand they're very backed up as well.
Yes.
So you could be waiting, well over a year to have your issue resolved, which is kind of pointless, really, if you think about it.
And beyond those obvious issues, and they're piling up. You back the camera up, look at the full perspective here of the rental market within Ontario. We are in dire need of landlords, private landlords wanting to step up, wanting to buy that property and convert it and create rental accommodations that is badly needed for people here. And with stories like this that are happening more and more people are just saying, I don't want to get involved with that. I don't want that worst case scenario of having a property and now I can't make the mortgage payments because a tenant for one reason or another has decided not to pay the rent, and it's going to take me upwards of a year, maybe 2 years before I ever even get a decision, never mind a dollar back on that.
Well, Mike, I also want to point something out, and I think that you bring up, both of you bring up a great point, but I don't know that it's actually ever been magnified or explored.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between who is providing or what type of entity is providing rental accommodation. For those who haven't studied it or dipped their toe into the pool, so to speak, and tested it out themselves, it may be reasonable that they don't understand or see that there is a difference, and I don't want to make any assumptions, but based on some of the commentary and some of the articles that I read and some of the, some of the input that you get from the general public about those articles, and not too many people are feeling too empathetic to the landlords a lot of the time. But there's a big difference between an organization, whether it's a corporation or whether it's a real estate investment trust that purchases, builds, or manages multi-unit rental properties versus private citizen who may have 1 or 2 or even 6 rental properties in their portfolio. There's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So that oftentimes there's a commentary that says something along the lines of, well, if your rent is the same amount of as what I would be paying for a mortgage, then why should I be renting for you? And if you can't cover it yourself, then shame on you, you're a greedy landlord and you deserve to lose the property, something along those lines. I've heard some variation of that or another over the last several years that I've been involved in the industry. But there's a big difference between that versus somebody who has sufficient, or an organization that has a sufficient number of units where they might be making a very small margin, but they're making it over a large number of units, and that allows them to carry and cover in the event that they have the odd negative scenario between the landlord and the tenant. And Rod, maybe you can go into some of that. I don't know whether you represent the REITs and the larger organizations, or you represent more the sort of the mom and pop individual. But I think it's important that we, as a collective, understand that sometimes the difference between housed and unhoused is a very small margin.
Yeah, I've represented both larger companies that own a lot of have a big rental portfolio, and a bunch of mom and pops that own 1 or two or a bunch, and even some seniors residences where they're not a care facility, but they're designated as a seniors residence. Yeah. And those people have, those organizations have sometimes hundreds of tenants in their buildings. But there is a big difference, and I wouldn't say that necessarily all large corporations that have rental units are bad. In fact, there's some really good ones that take care of their properties and take care of their tenants and look to have good relationships with them. But there's also just like the mom and pops, there's a lot of them that don't really care. They'd be what you call slumlords, right? Yeah. But it's a lot different dealing with them, because then in that case you're dealing with a property manager who's probably got several properties that they're dealing with when you have a problem, and sometimes it can take a while to get through to them, or it's very bureaucratic just dealing with them. Sometimes the bonus of dealing with a mom and pop landlord is that it's a lot easier. Go straight to the source, right? And I know I'm a landlord, and I try to take care of my properties very quickly because I want my renters to be happy, right, and take care of the place.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Rod, where we're located in Barrie presents a unique set of circumstances where we're close enough to the GTA. There's money there that is invested in the Barrie area. A lot of what gets deemed absentee landlords, out of sight, out of mind. And a lot of the problems we see happen there, and it's deliberate neglect. But there's also, there's a growing number of just people. The only way they're going to get in to buy a home and carry that mortgage is if they create that second suite. So we're seeing more and more. And you and I, we sat down. We were going to put together the bill to reintroduce second suites in Ontario, and then we quickly learned that I think it was the London MPP was already bringing that bill forward, and I'm glad that that bill went through, and now we are seeing the ability to have second suites throughout the province, because we do need them. But I think in many instances, where there are challenges, where there are conflicts between landlord and tenant, in those scenarios, it's just it's an amateurish mistake is often made. They just don't know how to be a good landlord. They haven't learned. They're not doing this professionally. And we're seeing more and more of that, where there's liabilities being created and scenarios created just because someone's never been a landlord before.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how much work it is actually to be a landlord. It's a lot of work if you want to be a good landlord. Yeah. And the more properties you have, the more work it is. And I'd say the biggest advice I'd give a landlord and a tenant, and a lot of this, goes for a tenant too, is be careful who your landlord is, and be careful who your tenant is. Remember, as a tenant, you can choose your landlord, and as a landlord, you can choose your tenant more or less. And be very careful who you rent to. Make sure you do a credit check. Make sure you do reference checks on them. Our business can do background checks on either potential tenants or employees or people in general. If you're looking for a really good tenant, but also landlords. Make sure you do a little research on your landlord. Find out if you get a chance to talk to the person who's in that unit at that. Before you, if you get a chance to ask them some questions, that's always good. Or to ask them some questions. If you know people who are in that building who also rent from the same landlord, ask them questions about how they've been managed and how they've been treated by their landlord. Yeah. But it's really incumbent on both sides to make sure that they don't get themselves in a mess, because it really is easy to avoid if you take care about who your landlord is and who your tenants are going to be. It can avoid a lot of problems down the road.
Yeah. If you are thinking about becoming a landlord, Rod, what advice do you have for somebody who's thinking about it? And I will tell you, I've had clients who come to me and say that they don't have a pension through their company, and they haven't had much success in the stock market, or they don't have the experience or the time to dedicate to having success in the stock market, but they'd like to do something for their children or for their retirement. And again, I think that that's all fair game. I think it should be something that people can do. And I'm going to pose a quick scenario to you, and then I'm going to ask you the question, but I think that there are I had a client who got really excited that they had 10 people apply to rent their property, and then they chose to go with the tenant who offered to pay them the most. And I smiled and I said, don't do it. Definitely don't do it. I think the thing that you want to do in that particular situation is count to 10. Don't get greedy. You're not in this for the short term, you're in this for the long term as an investment. You're going to see the property appreciate in value. You're going to cover your expenses for the most part, if not entirely. But if you go with the one who's paying you the most, that just doesn't smell right. Do your background checks, check it out, because this could be disastrous. And in a nutshell, it did. It went disastrous. We don't have time to get into that right now, but it went really disastrous. They lost a lot of money on this. Rod, before we go to break, thoughts on what you can do to prepare yourself to become a landlord?
Well, the best thing you can do is talk to someone who's a current landlord already and find out what their challenges have been and what their advice to you is. But also, I would go to the Landlord Tenant Board website, because it gives you a lot of information about what a landlord's rights and responsibilities are and what a tenant's rights and responsibilities are. And you know, a lot of people don't realize to lease to rent a property or lease a property, you have to use the Landlord Tenant Board contract. You don't need to go out and find your own or create your own. They're already there. In fact, you have to use them. That's the law. You have to use their dedicated contract. You can have Schedule A's that add certain things to it, but it really lays out what the rules and rights and responsibilities are for landlords and for tenants. It's a great place to start.
Very good advice, Rod. And when we come back from the break, let's talk a little bit about some of the recourse options that are available to both a landlord, to both a tenant, an owner, anybody who's involved somewhere in a transaction of real estate. And we'll be right back after the break with Rod Jackson of Full Force Legal Services.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're thrilled to be joined by Rod Jackson, who's a paralegal and a partner at Full Force Legal Services in Barrie. Rod, you've got lots of experience, you know, in working with clients who have a breach of contract scenario, or they're dealing with a landlord-tenant board scenario. But you know, I think that. You know, in any scenario, no matter how well the law is set up or isn't, there's always somebody who's going to find a creative way to work around the laws as they exist. Something tells me that in your tenure, you've had some interesting scenarios come on your plate that sort of just fell outside the law. And what happens in those scenarios?
Yeah, there are, as a landlord and as a tenant, there are some scenarios that everyone needs to be aware of. So everyone knows the Landlord-Tenant Board kind of manages through the Residential Tenancies Act the disputes that happen between renters and landlords. But there are a couple scenarios where the Landlord-Tenant Board has no jurisdiction, and in which case leaves you with, you know, different resources at your and recourse to your problems. So, for example, if you're renting a room in your house, or you're renting a basement apartment, for example, that has shared facilities like a shared laundry facility or shared kitchen or anything that's kind of shared, then it's a shared occupancy, in which case it does not fall under the Residential Tenancies Act, and therefore you don't have to use the Landlord-Tenant Board or the Residential Tenancies Act designated contract anymore. You can use your own contract, and all the general rules don't apply, aside from the obvious ones about human rights and you know, those sort of protections. No. But the other scenario where it doesn't apply is if the other scenario where it doesn't apply is if you have family that is living in the house. So if you have a house, for example, I have a house in Sudbury that my daughter lives in, and we rent out 5 rooms in that house. The Landlord-Tenant Board doesn't have jurisdiction. The Residential Tenancies Act doesn't have jurisdiction over that, because I have an immediate family member that lives in that home.
Where does jurisdiction lie with regards to short-term rental? You know, the weekend rentals. I don't want to use the, you know, the term that it's often referred to, which isn't a generic term. It's actually a corporation. But I think we know what I'm talking about when I say short-term rentals, the weekend vacation rental properties.
Yeah,
we see more and more of them popping up. Do the provisions of the Landlord-Tenant Act apply there and the protections as well?
No.
No.
No, they don't.
So I guess that falls probably under the Hotel Act or something like that.
That's a good question. I think there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace about where those belong. I know there's a lot of debate about it, and right now most people are going to small claims over issues that they have with that stuff. But as with anything, if you want to litigate against somebody, you got to make sure you have their name, address, phone number, all that stuff, all their information. A lot of times with some of those organizations you're talking about, they don't get all that information.
Yeah.
Exactly. Make sure you get all the information from your tenant and from the landlord that you're renting from, because you want to there's a lot of things you need to make sure of as a tenant when you're going into a weekend rental for an Airbnb or something that you want to make sure about.
Yeah, well, and I think something that's quite of a fair amount of interest, there are a number of jurisdictions that have had challenges that the neighbors have brought forth to their councils of challenges, and they want licensing or they want regulations and bylaws. And as much as the intentions were good, and as much as it's very profitable for some and enjoyable for others, I think that it's quite obvious that there are challenges. But one of the things that you did mention at Airbnb, so I'll go there, is the challenge with properties being used for parties or raves or dances or whatever it may be, and that's created quite a stir in many municipalities or jurisdictions. And I think it was just recently announced the corporation Airbnb worldwide basically set out a law that said you're not allowed to rent for a party, and if you rent for a party, you're blacklisted, you're banned, and they're trying to do their part. I think they recognize that there is a challenge. So it is a commercial contract. It is a relationship between and a contract with the users of the service and those who put their property on there, and that's one thing that is being addressed. But Rod, I do have a question before we move on to sort of the next component that we could discuss, but really is, as someone who represents both landlords and tenants, and who has sat as an adjudicator with the tribunal itself, do you have any recommendations for anybody in politics who might be listening on how we can improve some of the things you've talked about? Because I think you said it could be several months backlog, and if not a year before a resolution in many cases. What have you seen, and what would you recommend if it was yours to rewrite the program?
Yeah, if it was mine, I'd go back to mostly in-person hearings. Right now, they're all exclusively remotely done through Zoom. And it can be difficult as a tenant and as an adjudicator. If you can imagine, one dispute, one application can have up to 6 people involved with it. By the time you get witnesses and representatives and the actual applicants themselves on each side. And so at any given day, you're going to have 70 people on the screen that an adjudicator has to manage and check in. And it can take up to 2 hours just to check those people in. So that's an adjudicator's time of 2 hours just to check people in. And so they're not getting to the end of the docket. So I think going back to in-person would make that process much quicker, and also lend some administrative support that doesn't exist now for adjudicators. And the fact that there's very little administrative support for adjudicators, it really, really lengthens the time it takes for them to deal with a docket in a day, but also an application throughout a month or whatever. There's very little support there. And I think just in-person's better in general. You get to read body language a little bit better. You can ask questions. You can, when you have administrative support that's present there, that you can write the orders much faster. And I think, not unlike a committee of adjustment at a city, for those that know what that is, they make decisions right on the fly, like in the moment. And I think it is possible if you had a board of 2 or 3 adjudicators at one time that heard a bunch of cases in a day. I think you get through them a lot faster, and I think the orders can be made right on the spot rather than waiting months and months for them to get written. I think relooking at that and the back-end software case management system they have, which is very archaic, needs to be changed. I think if they did those things, we'd look at an LTB system as a lot more efficient and a lot more helpful for tenants and landlords in general.
So another example of where the presumed efficiencies and cost efficiencies of doing things virtually just don't apply. Certainly not in this case, among other reasons.
This is a scenario. This is a scenario where I see it as a lot of people interpreted this as, oh, it's more taxpayers' dollars or there's money that we don't have. But if we actually look at the cost of taking that year, and it may not be one line item on a single ledger in and out, but if we actually look at the actual cost involved with the delay versus actually making an investment of getting more people as tribunal adjudicators and invest in that software, I think it would absolutely speak for itself. But Mike,
couldn't have said it better myself.
Is that what you wanted?
But further to that, I presume that the system, I know in past it's been located within the GTA. If you had a hearing to attend wherever you were in the province, or at least within central, south central Ontario, you went to the city. Now, I think in terms of, we're talking about where there could be improvements and efficiencies created, correct me if I'm wrong, do we have local tribunal networks set up, and is that something that can and should be done? Obviously it should be. If we're waiting a year or two for people to finally get their day in court on these things, then perhaps being able, if you're a population of say 100,000 or more, you should have at least one representative right there locally looking after these things.
Yeah, and that's the way it was. They had moved before the pandemic hit. There was an LTD tribunal that was heard hearing cases, I think once or at least once, but maybe even twice a week on Simcoe Street down at Service Ontario and Barrie. And they would take, the catchment area for, I think, Orillia and Midland, like that whole Georgian Triangle area. There's a GTA had a lot, a big catchment area, but also a lot of resources to deal with. And tribunal members were actually traveling from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to make sure that they were hitting some of the smaller areas up north and out east and in different places in Ontario. So, they I think thought they were going to save a lot of money by getting rid of some of the capital expenditures they had to rent properties or to use some of the capital assets that they had to have these hearings in and liquidate them. But I think the amount of time that they're losing by having adjudicators, sift through 70 odd people every morning from 8 to 10 o'clock and then not getting through their decisions, and then the time it takes to get through one application is absolutely crazy for an adjudicator. And they have 15 in a day that they do. It's just not sustainable.
Yeah, and these are things we're learning as we go, because we've had our Attorney General Doug Downey on the show a couple times, and he's made a point, and he's quite proud of the fact that he's bringing the judicial system into the 21st century with regards to technology and creating efficiencies, but it's not across the board. There are still some things where the old school face-to-face works best, I would think. So there's got to be a good balance.
I think Doug's doing a great job at actually bringing our legal system into the modern times. There's some growing pains here too, right? Yeah, like I think it's finding out where technology best works and where it doesn't really work.
Yeah, it's not across the board.
Right now, no, like a lot of small claims, settlement conferences and small claims trials are not in person, they're remote now. There is a convenience factor to that, no doubt, especially when you talk about criminal courts and things like that, that speed things up quite a bit. But, you just can't, like my dad always says, you can't fax a look in the eye or a handshake. It's, same thing with, Zoom. You just don't get the same look in the eye and the handshake, that person to person. I think you need things like a court case, like when you're going in on a trial or you're going into an adjudication. I think you miss a lot by not having people in person, and a lot of efficiencies. So I think finding that balance between that hybrid between having a really good system that works with people and one that works with technology is where we need to be. Being all one or all the other, I don't think is the answer. And right now, we've kind of the pendulum swung towards technology because of the pandemic, and we had to do that. But I think we got to come back somewhere in the middle where we can use both effectively and create a really efficient system. And I think that's where the growing pains are for Doug and the government to be finding the right place for technology in the justice system. It definitely has a lot of potential to save a lot of time and money and to clean the system out. But I think finding that happy medium is yet to happen.
I think that there are a lot of the vast majority of people, whether you're on the tenant side or whether you're on the landlord side, good people who have a disagreement, good people who need a mediator to solve the challenge, whatever that may be. But for those who are taking advantage of the system, for those, as you expressed, there's the odd occasion where the landlord says, what are you going to do? You're going to take me to the board? It's going to take you a year. I'll starve you to death. And then on the other side, there are those tenants who say, what are you going to do? I'm just going to stop paying rent and it's going to take you a year. And there are professionals who rent places and have no intention of paying. So my question, though, is as an adjudicator, someone who's seen this, I personally believe that having access to the judicial system is important. We need to make sure that the barriers to gaining that access are as low as possible. But on the flip side, are the incentives or the disincentives strong enough for those who do knowingly go and commit what I'm going to refer to as a crime, knowingly break the law, for those who knowingly take advantage of the vulnerable, whether it's a landlord or a tenant? Are the financial penalties or disincentives strong enough?
No, no, they're not. I think, right now, I'll use the case where we had a client who was owed, by the time, when we started with them, they were owed $30,000. By the time we got through the landlord-tenant board system, they owed $40,000. They were owed $40,000. Okay, so they got a judgment, but then now we got to go collect the money, right? And these people, when they got the judgment, they moved out. They just moved out and they disappeared. And there's no way to find them. So there's no recourse for that landlord, right? And the same thing happens when people move out of their, if they have a problem, they had to move out because the place was dilapidated and the landlord wouldn't fix it. And they go and they get an order against the landlord. I mean, what are they going to do? Get an order for the landlord to fix it after they moved out? At that point, they don't really care, right? Yeah. And it's really frustrating that there's no teeth. To get teeth for some of these orders, you have to go to a sheriff or a bailiff, or depending on the situation, and exercise your enforcement rights through the small claims court. And so even if you go through the LTB by yourself without a representative, which I don't advise, by the way, you have to then go to enforcement. And if you don't have a representative, it can be very confusing about okay, I got an order, I got a piece of paper, what do I do with it? That's only the kind of the first step, so to speak. So I don't know if I answered your question. I got off on a bit of a tangent there. But,
I think you did answer my question. We got to go to break, but when we come back, let's pick up actually on something we talked about a little bit earlier in the show, and that's, again, some misunderstandings on what is legal and what is not, and what do some people think that if they just put it in the contract, they can get away with, and that's something we're going to talk about, Mike, referred to as is condition. But let's go to break. When we come back, we'll have more with Rod Jackson from Full Force Legal Services, rounding out the show on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're with Rod Jackson, a full service.
Nope. Try it one more time.
Full Force Legal Service.
Hang on, bars. There we go.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're having a great conversation with Rod Jackson of Full Force Legal Services, better call Rod. And one of the things we touched on earlier, Rod, was something that I see all too often with real estate listings that are put together. There's that little line in there that says, house being sold as is. And I think the seller believes by putting that in there, they've absolved themselves of any responsibility or liability for anything within that house. That's just not the case. And maybe we can touch on that with you, and if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I've had a situation where that was the case. Someone thought that they were buying, that they were selling a house as is, and that can be dangerous too, because as is can be interpreted in a few different ways, right? As is could mean, all the appliances are included, all the furnishings are included, all the fixtures are included. So it goes both ways. Mm-hmm. But it's very hard to define what as is means. You're so much better to put specifics into a contract. If you don't put specifics in there, there's way too much space for people to
misinterpret,
shimmy around and misinterpret. And I don't think necessarily people are looking to defraud anybody or anything like that necessarily all the time, but there's a ton of room for error and for misunderstanding. Yeah. I'd say that for any contract, whether you're buying a car or a house or anything, it's very popular, as is very popular with cars too, and I don't recommend doing that either.
I was just going to ask you about that. Would it be the same interpretation of the law that as is a vehicle seller has to disclose if there's any known defects in the vehicle, or as is? Because I can't tell you the last time I saw someone selling a car as is and it didn't actually have flaws or implied that it had flaws.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually as is, like in the automotive business, which I'm familiar with as well, just means that you're buying a car that hasn't been inspected.
Okay, but let me ask you a different question, though. There is a big difference between, there's a huge difference in the actual way the law is written to protect humans and families and people who have, are vulnerable to having a roof over their head or not, versus the law in real estate as it applies in commercial transactions. And again, we should be very clear in our disclosure. Rod, you are not a lawyer, therefore you are not directly tied into the real estate transaction as one would normally think of a real estate transaction. But when it comes to a breach of contract scenario, in a commercial transaction in real estate, it is buyer beware. It is incumbent on the buyer to do all of their homework, and they don't get any free passes. There is no additional court protection to ensure the livelihood of, for example, the vulnerable being children who may be negatively impacted if something goes wrong. So in an as-is scenario, in a commercial real estate transaction, is there the same implication that in an as-is you still have to make the disclosures?
Yeah, I think it's expected that you make disclosures on any sale of any private item. It's in your own best interest to disclose too what the issues might be. It just saves you a lot of problems down the road. And I would say too, to your point that it's buyer beware and you have to be careful. That's absolutely true. But on the other hand, courts do look more favorably when there's a dispute upon the person who is the signee, or the signor rather, of the contract. So if you're the buyer, the assumption goes, especially if you're unrepresented by a real estate agent or by a lawyer in that transaction, that is generally accepted that you're not as sophisticated as the person who's selling the property. I mean, when I say that, I don't mean it as an insult. I mean, legally speaking, sophisticated. So, for example, you and Mike understand a real estate transaction. A real estate lawyer would understand a real estate transaction very clearly, but a buyer who maybe is unrepresented or even represented sometimes won't be as sophisticated in that transaction, that specific transaction, and therefore the courts will look a little more favorably upon someone that maybe misunderstood a contract or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind. But generally speaking, buyer beware. You need to be very, very cautious. Make sure you read your contracts thoroughly. Absolutely, especially when you're buying a home, make sure a lawyer reviews it. You'd be crazy not to have a lawyer review a real estate contract before you purchase a house. I've seen it happen though.
Yeah, and the biggest takeaway so far we've talked about is be proactive, do your due diligence, and do it ahead of time. The other thing you've touched on a couple times here is self-representation, and in your business, for sure, you're going before a tribunal. You're not familiar with how that process works. Do you really want to be self-representing? And more often than not, that's going to be to your own detriment if you do. We certainly come up against that as realtors too, as the temptation is there to self-represent. One of the things I say is one of the greatest selling points of using a professional realtor is we are insured. We have errors and omissions insurance, which that protection is also carries over and covers to a certain degree that purchaser or seller. What are your thoughts on self-representation as it creates a legal scenario or a legal challenge for people, and certainly as it applies in representing yourself legally when you go before a tribunal?
Yeah, you know, people don't understand that a lot of tribunals, as, you know, a landlord-tenant tribunal, for example, operates just like a small claims hearing would, or what you would see in court, where, you know, you make your opening statements, there's witnesses, they get called, they get cross-examined, all this sort of stuff. So unless you're familiar with that process and you understand what the adjudicator is looking for from both parties, don't represent yourself.
Yeah.
I'd say in any tribunal or even in small claims, you know, if you want to take it for a spin and try it out, my bet is you're going to end up calling a paralegal or a lawyer anyway, because it can get pretty consuming. It's very administratively heavy. There's a lot of forms to fill out. There's a lot of things you need to do. And I think it's probably the same way with a real estate transaction, right? You need to make sure that all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed.
Well, I can't tell you how many times Mike, you and I have had these conversations where we look at somebody who's self-represented or whatever, and we look at each other and we're like, man, to save themselves $1, it costs them $10 in other opportunity. And I think that, you know, again, a little bit of information is a really dangerous thing. The internet is an amazing resource, but I wouldn't want to, you know, I wouldn't want you to hire me to do your open heart surgery because I read a blog online. And there are a lot of people who look at the travel industry and all of these types of discount buying websites where you can go in and do your own, and like, why the heck should I pay a travel agent? I just did it myself and I saved money. When they don't realize the fine print about what's being offered on those sites is not the same thing that's being offered through a realtor, or sorry, through a travel agent in that particular case. And it's kind of the same thing in any industry.
Yeah. And, you know, there's one other thing that I always notice, and I notice it as an adjudicator and as an advocate for people, is that, you know, when people go to a tribunal or to a court, often they're quite emotional about their case, and they end up talking about things that really don't matter, legally speaking, that don't have a lot of credence or actually harm them. And what a representative is able to do, what an advocate, whether it's a real estate agent or a paralegal or a lawyer do, is strip that emotion that has no legal probative value out, and just sticks with a legal argument, that your best legal argument in the case. And that's what an adjudicator wants to hear. They don't want to sift through everything that you're talking about and all your feelings. It's not a therapy session, you know. They want to get right down to the point, legally speaking. And an advocate, whether it's a real estate agent or a paralegal or a lawyer, are able to do that very effectively, and it keeps the time down. It keeps the arguments very clear and concise and easier to understand. Yeah. And especially if you're self-representing up against a represented person, almost never ever goes well.
Well, with that in mind, I think that those are great parting words. Those are great words to wrap things up with. I don't know if we could have actually planned it any better if we'd actually planned it. But it's been a great conversation with you, Rod. And I want to thank you for taking your time this morning or today to join us on the show. But for those of you who want to take note, you know, you can hire a lawyer, but there are also going to be cases where a paralegal may be able to give you some good information. And of course, I'm sure if it goes outside the scope of your professional, scope, you'd be sure to connect them appropriately or advise them appropriately. But Rod Jackson, partner at Full Force Legal Services, thank you very much for joining us on Hitting Home, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.